Thank you very much for that introduction. In the interest of time, I'll just say very succinctly that I owe my career and much, much more to Jon Hanson, so it's a real honor to be here today. I'm going to present a rather unfashionable argument, which is that environmental law's future lies in its past. By now, most of us are familiar with a reform story in which the excesses of our early attempts to regulate the environment are thought to be in need of discipline by the twin insights of sound science and economic reasoning. This is not merely an argument in favor of using thorough and reliable empirical information about the consequences of policy proposals. After all, no one is arguing that policies should be based on moral principles alone, irrespective of the consequences they hold. No one would argue that, right? Instead, the economic reform story contends that regulation should be crafted in a way such that it replicates the workings of a hypothetical perfect market, one which lacks messy features such as externalities, market power, or lack of information. The kinds of market failures which, at least according to the last administration's OMB, provide the justification for collective political action. Shoring up those failures of the market will ensure that they work in turn to maximize overall welfare. Welfare then in turn is meant to be a capacious concept encompassing anything of significance to human well-being. Those consequences, though, must always be located within an individual citizen's welfare function, as opposed to some collective entity such as perhaps an entire community that might be adversely impacted by climate change, or a non-human species that might be similarly endangered, or worse yet, an endangered species that does not happen to be a charismatic megafauna. He's a pika. He's very charismatic. He's not mega. Climate change is forcing he and his ilk to seek habitat at higher and higher elevations. Eventually, like the sea level rise, as it threatens small island countries, eventually he'll run out of land to scale. In addition to being individualistic, anthropocentric, welfare consequences also must always be converted in some fashion to a common and continuous quantitative metric, as opposed to some lexically ordered metric that would treat certain rights and resources as inviolable. So when applied to environmental health and safety regulation, this means no resource can be treated as sacrosanct or incommensurable. Instead, for instance, even human lives, having been rendered commensurable through monetization, they become indistinct within a consequentialist landscape. Now, when we combine this with the exclusively individualistic conception of where it is that welfare resides, this approach can lead to absurd results. So, for instance, nothing within the welfare economic framework precludes the possibility that it may appear to be welfare maximizing to reject regulations that are necessary to ensure future generations continue to exist. That is, nothing within the framework excludes the possibility that it could be welfare maximizing to sacrifice every single member of a future generation such that humanity ceases to exist, while the stock of capital that supposedly makes those future generations better off continues somehow to grow exponentially in bank accounts that will never be withdrawn. Still, with the semblance of comprehensiveness and uniform treatment, the welfare economic framework promises a method by which all relevant interests will be accounted for, objectively, even-handedly, in the determination of public policy. So compelling has this promise become that cost-benefit analysis is now regarded as a basically non-partisan, non-controversial fixture of the regulatory state. Now, I want to suggest that this tale, in which risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis are the heroes that save us from the excesses and naivete of 1970s era environmentalism, I want to suggest this has caused us to lose sight of a great deal of practical and moral wisdom that remains alive within those early and supposedly inefficient environmental laws. I want to suggest we should go back to the future to recover this wisdom before we go about writing the next chapter to the story. So to support this unfashionable argument, I'm going to offer two examples from a recent EPA rulemaking in which, at least in my view, the economic approach to environmental law has spilled over into areas beyond its competence. These examples come from a cost-benefit analysis conducted by EPA in connection with issuing a long-delayed rule to reduce mercury emissions. Now, although there are numerous health benefits from mercury emissions reduction, the primary health benefit assigned to the Mercury Rule by EPA, because it was the one that was quantitatively estimable, consisted of avoided instances of mental impairment from in utero exposure due to elevated maternal blood mercury levels, typically caused in turn by contaminated fish consumption. So to assess the welfare significance of this health benefit, the EPA's regulatory analysts estimated the number of IQ points that otherwise would be lost from mercury emissions, which the analysts then transformed into a dollar value by referencing empirical studies which show a relationship between IQ levels and earning potential. Citing a need to be comprehensive, however, the analysts then reduced the dollar value of IQ losses due to the fewer years of education that individuals with lower IQ levels typically seek, which in turn saves society the resources that are lost through tuition expenditures, foregone years of productive labor. So the benefit of avoiding mercury-induced mental impairment was first reduced to a crude measure of the wage impact of intelligence, and then further reduced to reflect the offsetting cost associated with higher IQ levels. So to see why this approach was inadequate, consider what would have happened if the costs of higher intelligence had turned out to be greater than the enhanced earning potential. If it is true that everything depends on what the facts turn out to be, as the cost-benefit optimizer would have it, then it well could have been optimal for the EPA to mandate increased mercury emissions, since the IQ level of our children would have appeared to be inefficiently high according to our welfare accounting. Or imagine for a moment the question facing society was not whether to allow mercury emissions to inflict harm on unborn children, but whether to use genetic engineering techniques to directly engineer newborns with reduced intelligence. Now, at that point, some might invite philosophical debate about whether ignorance truly is bliss, but would anyone seriously contend that the question should be resolved by comparing the child's earning potential to avoided tuition expenses? Now, although the example is purely hypothetical, the critical analytical point is that there are no resources within the welfare economic paradigm to avoid this conclusion. Just as it can appear to be welfare maximizing to cause future generations no longer to exist, it also can appear that we are better off as a society with the mental capacity of our children deliberately reduced.